February 21st, 1994, Arlington, Virginia. A gray Jaguar XJ6 pulls out of a suburban driveway. Behind the wheel is a 52-year-old man wearing a suit. He looks like a typical bureaucrat, a mid-level manager, someone who pushes paper for a living. And in many ways, that is exactly what he is. But as he turns onto the street, his world explodes. Suddenly, unmarked cars swarm the vehicle. They pull the man out of the car, slamming him onto the hood of his luxury vehicle. The man doesn't scream. He doesn't reach for a weapon. He just looks at them with a mixture of resignation and arrogance. His name is Aldrich Ames, and at that moment, he is the most damaging mole in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. For 9 years, this man sat inside the headquarters of the CIA. He sat in the very offices dedicated to counterintelligence against the Soviet Union, and every day he was selling the names of American spies to the KGB. He traded human lives for cash. He traded the safety of his country for a Jaguar, a bigger house, and a lifestyle he could not afford. This is the story of the man who sold the CIA. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the man. Aldrich Ames was not a mastermind. He was not a brilliant ideological defector like Kim Philby. He was, by all accounts, a disappointment. He was a legacy hire. His father had worked for the CIA, and Aldrich coasted into the agency on his father's reputation. But he was mediocre. His supervisors considered him lazy. He had a drinking problem. He fell asleep at his desk after long, boozy lunches. He was the kind of employee who gets promoted just to get him out of the way. But in 1983, the CIA made a fatal mistake. They promoted him to the Soviet East European Division. They gave this mediocre, debt-ridden alcoholic access to the most sensitive list of names in the entire US government. The list of Soviet officials who were secretly spying for America. Ames was drowning in debt. He had gone through a messy divorce. He had a new wife, Rosario, who had expensive tastes. He was desperate for money. And in the world of espionage, desperation is a doorway. On April 16, 1985, Aldrich Ames walked through that door. He didn't wait to be recruited. He didn't wait for a KGB agent to approach him in a bar. He walked right into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He handed the receptionist an envelope. Inside was a note demanding $50,000. In exchange, he offered 2 names of Soviet officials who were working for the CIA. He thought this would be a one-time deal, a quick transaction to pay off his credit cards. He told himself that these 2 agents were double agents anyway, so no real harm would be done. But once you cross that line, there is no going back. The KGB paid him the money immediately. They saw exactly who he was, a man motivated by greed. And Ames realized something that terrified and exhilarated him. It was easy. It was incredibly easy to sell secrets. 2 months later, in June 1985, Aldrich Ames decided to go all in. He met his handler at a lunch spot called Chadwick's in Georgetown. He carried plastic bags filled with documents. This event is now known in intelligence history as the Big Dump. In those bags, Ames handed over the identities of virtually every Soviet intelligence officer who was working for the CIA and the FBI. He didn't hold anything back. He gave them the crown jewels. He effectively wiped out the entire American human intelligence network in the Soviet Union in a single afternoon. The results were immediate and brutal. Across the world, CIA assets began to vanish. One of the most tragic victims was General Dmitri Polyakov. Code name Top Hat. Polyakov was the highest-ranking Soviet asset the US ever had. He was a general in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. For 20 years, he had provided Washington with critical information on Soviet missiles, nuclear strategy, and the rift between China and Russia. He did it because he hated the corruption of the Soviet system. He didn't do it for money, he did it for principle. He was a true hero of the Cold War. Because of Ames, Polyakov was arrested. He was interrogated, tortured, and eventually executed. He was taken into a room, made to kneel, and shot in the back of the head. His body was dumped in an unmarked grave. Another victim was Adolf Tolkachev, the billion-dollar spy, the man who gave the US the blueprints for Soviet radar systems. Executed. Valery Martinov. a KGB officer stationed in Washington, executed. Sergei Motorin, another KGB major, executed. In total, Aldrich Ames compromised more than 100 intelligence operations. He is directly responsible for the execution of at least 10 high-level sources. These were men who trusted the CIA to protect them, and the CIA failed them because the man in charge of their security was the one signing their death warrants. Back at CIA headquarters in Langley, panic set in. By late 1985 and early 1986, the agency realized they were going blind. Assets were disappearing, communications were going dead. But the CIA suffered from a crippling case of denial. They couldn't believe they had a mole. They blamed everything else. They thought the Soviets had broken their communication codes. They thought their agents were just sloppy. They even blamed another defector, Edward Lee Howard, for the losses. The idea that a senior officer inside the Soviet division was a traitor was too painful to accept. So, the investigation dragged on for years. Meanwhile, Aldrich Ames was getting rich. The KGB paid him well. Over the course of 9 years, they paid him roughly $2.7 million directly, with another $2 million promised. He was the highest-paid spy in history. And this is where the story turns from a tragedy into a farce. Ames was terrible at hiding his money. A spy is supposed to be invisible. A spy is supposed to blend in. But Ames began living like a millionaire on a government salary of $60,000 a year. He bought a house in Arlington for $540,000, and he paid for it in cash. He spent thousands of dollars on designer suits. He spent $30,000 on dental work to fix his yellow teeth. His credit card bills were astronomical, often exceeding his monthly salary, and most famously, he bought a luxury car, the Jaguar XJ6. He drove this flashy, expensive British car into the CIA parking lot every single day. He parked it next to the beat-up Hondas and Fords of his colleagues. It was a screaming red flag. It was a neon sign that said, "I am corrupt." But because of the CIA's culture, because he was one of the boys, nobody questioned him. When colleagues asked how he could afford it, he made up a flimsy lie about his wife's family being wealthy in Colombia. And they believed him. Or they chose not to look. He was brazen. He would meet his KGB handlers in Bogota, Colombia, or in Vienna. He used a system of dead drops around Washington, D.C. He would leave a chalk mark on a mailbox, a signal site nicknamed GAMBIT, to let the Russians know he was ready to make a drop. He would leave bags of documents in drainage pipes and under footbridges in Rock Creek Park. In return, he would pick up packages of cash. He wasn't a master of tradecraft. He often left classified documents in his car. He left his computer on. He drank heavily during the day. He was sloppy, but he was protected by the bureaucracy's inability to police its own. Finally, in the early 90s, a small team of mole hunters inside the CIA, led by women like Sandra Grimes and Jean Vertefeuille, began to close in. They started looking at the finances. They correlated the dates of Ames' meetings with the dates of large cash deposits in his bank accounts. The pattern was undeniable. Ames would have lunch with a Soviet diplomat. The next day, he would walk into his bank and deposit $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in cash. The mole hunters built a timeline. It matched perfectly with the disappearance of the agents in 1985. The FBI took over the investigation. They bugged his house, they tapped his phone. They even broke into his house while he was away and found the smoking gun. A note in his trash can where he was calculating his finances and his payments from the KGB. He had written it all down. On February 21st, 1994, the game ended. The arrest on the street was swift. When the FBI agents told him he was under arrest, Ames tried to play the role of the confused bureaucrat. But as they cuffed him, the reality set in. When the news broke, it shattered the intelligence community. The director of the CIA was forced to resign. The damage assessment was catastrophic. The information Ames gave the Soviets allowed them to deceive the US government for nearly a decade. They had been feeding false information to the US through double agents that Ames had identified. The US military had spent billions of dollars developing defenses against Soviet weapons based on intelligence that might have been compromised. Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife, Rosario, who was complicit in the spying and enjoyed the money, was also arrested and sent to prison. Today, Aldrich Ames sits in a high-security federal prison in Terre, Haute, Indiana. He is an old man now. In interviews, he has shown very little remorse. He talks about the betrayal as a business transaction. He rationalizes his actions by saying the Cold War was a game, and the people who died were just players who lost. But they weren't just players. General Polyakov was a father and a grandfather. The agents executed in the basements of Lubyanka prison were human beings who risked everything for freedom. Aldrich Ames sold their lives so he could drive a Jaguar and fix his teeth. The Ames case forced a complete overhaul of how the CIA monitors its own employees. It introduced strict financial disclosures and more rigorous polygraph tests. But the scar remains. It is a permanent reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one outside the walls, pointing a missile at you. The most dangerous enemy is the one sitting at the desk next to you, smiling while he sells your secrets to the highest bidder. Aldrich Ames is the definition of the banality of evil. He didn't destroy the CIA for ideology, he did it for greed, and that makes his betrayal the coldest of all. This concludes the file on Aldrich Ames. We have looked at the scientists who built the weapons and the traitor who sold the secrets. Next, we must examine the tools of the trade. In the next file, we will explore a weapon that sounds like science fiction, but was very real. A gun that fires a bullet made of ice and poison, leaving no trace of the murder. The next file is classified.